Welcome to Tiny Expeditions, Season 5, Episode 4. Today we're talking about genetic engineering in pop culture, a topic so hot we're splitting it into 2 episodes. I'm Dr. Sarah Sharman, here to help you understand the science.
And my name is Chris Powell. I will be your storytelling guide for this episode. Sarah, we've had a lot of fun with this season, talking about pop culture references, and today is no different. We've got a pop culture reference, and this is a movie that has been out for quite a while, right?
That's right, we're talking about GATTACA, which came out in 1997.
So GATTACA, there's obviously some nods to our basic understanding of DNA there, but give us a kind of a synopsis of what's happening in case people haven't seen the movie.
Sure, GATTACA is a science fiction film. It's set in a future where human genomes are very broadly understood and easily, not to mention absurdly quickly, sequenced. Scientists have connected traits like intelligence and attractiveness and many different health conditions to people's DNA.
The film GATTACA has been out for many years. It came out in the mid-90s, and well, that just goes to show you how long this topic has been in our collective consciousness, right? We've been talking for a long time about what we can do with the genetic information stored inside of our DNA.
GATTACA came out even before the Human Genome Project was really going, and we've learned so much information about the human genome since then. And we're learning so much more, and we're applying it to improve the human condition. And in this movie, they're taking it a step further, and they're using genetic information to basically create the perfect human. And I'm not sure that's something that we are equipped to do or ethically should do, and we'll talk about that later in this episode for sure.
Yeah, just hearing the beginnings of this conversation lets me know that we need to have another voice in here. We need to have a bioethicist join us on this one.
So we brought in Tiny Expedition's favorite bioethicist, Dr. Tom May.
Yeah, my name's Thomas May. I am the Floyd and Judy Rogers Endowed Professor at Washington State University's College of Medicine. And I'm also a research faculty at HudsonAlpha Institute for Biotechnology. My areas of expertise are in bioethics and social and moral philosophy. I specialize in areas of genomics and the ethical, legal, and social implications of genomic medicine and genomic research.
The main premise of the movie, which you know, is that these people are living in a world where they know so much about the human genome, they can analyze them quickly, they've somehow gotten all this information out of it that we don't have yet. So scientists have connected traits like intelligence and athleticism and attractiveness to specific genetic regions, and then upon birth, they're sequencing these kids and giving them basically a perfection score, and then their whole life is based on their genome, right? Scientific limitations aside, why is this problematic, or is it problematic, I guess?
I think a lot of people find this disturbing because it really gets at some of the issues at the heart of questions about human nature, especially about free will. You know, we know that there are some things that are predominantly determined by genetics, but most things we think anyway are an interaction, if you will, between nature and nurture. It's an interaction between genetics and our environment, right? So I think that a movie like GATTACA is suggesting that the free will aspect of determining traits of individuals is less important and maybe not even important at all. And this is a possibility. You know, there are psychologists who will explain our behaviors through sort of reward systems where we are conditioned to behave in a certain way and react to certain stimuli. And so I think GATTACA suggests that we don't really have free will, but really are kind of determined by our genetic makeup. And even our interactions with our environment are predominantly determined. Maybe not in our genetics, but in our genetics reaction to predetermined environmental factors that are explained in other sort of deterministic ways.
When we're talking about determinism here, when we're talking about choosing a specific trait over another, in your view, where is that coming from? In other words, who is deciding what is a preferential trait versus a non-preferential trait?
Well, I think Chris, that's a very, very good question. I think it gets at the heart of the designer baby issue, if you will. You'll often hear people warn against designer babies or humans playing God in determining what traits they want their children to have, rather than have that be a determination that involves some random luck and random factors. And one of the reasons we worry about that is that there is a value judgment that goes into uh, how we judge any particular trait. So you'll often hear of folks in the deaf community, for example, refusing cochlear implants, for example, or something because they find a value in the trait of being deaf. And they believe it is discriminatory to view that as a disability that should be corrected, but instead prefer that their children have the rich experience of the life of a deaf person in the deaf community, right? So that's an example of how something that many people may consider an undesirable trait may be considered a desirable trait by many other folks, right? And we know there are certain cultures where folks like me who have a little extra poundage uh, on their frame, that's revered. I would like to move to one of those where I would, but
I'll go with you.
but it's revered, and we know that there are other societies where it's not, right? So a lot of these traits, there are sort of relativistic value judgments being made within a social context that can reflect a bias or discrimination that we're afraid gets sort of embedded in the choice of what traits people have. And part of the richness of life is having a diversity of people and lifestyles and ways of doing things that we can sort of experiment with.
I really appreciate Tom talking about diversity in this way, because one of the things that you've taught me, Sarah, is that when it comes to the scientific enterprise, biodiversity is something that is very important.
Absolutely, Chris. We're all who we are today because of random genetic changes that occurred. And if we didn't have diversity, those would not happen.
And philosophically, this checks out as well, because there are certain philosophical schools that tell us that we only know ourselves because of what we are not. In other words, it's the otherness of the people around us that help us figure out who we are and define who we are as people. I also really appreciate what he said regarding relativistic judgments that are being made in social contexts that reflect our social bias. Again, this is why this season is so important, because there's so many of us who encounter a movie like Gattaca and we've never really thought about where our value judgments on what is considered an ability or disability, like where those come from. But when we're able to see ourselves in a film like this and attached to characters, we can allow ourselves to ask those types of questions that we may have not considered before. Like, who defines our perception of what is a desirable trait? And do we agree with that perception? And what's the moral center of it all? And if we're super inquisitive, we may even start to question the external factors that influence us, like marketing campaigns, familial structures, a culture's normative history, socioeconomic status, and social media algorithms, and how all of those help define what we find to be valuable in traits.
And I think a major thing that stood out to me in the movie is that after the main character's parents had him naturally and then saw the consequences that were thrust upon him, they decided to have a kid using a geneticist.
Like most other parents of their day, they were determined that their next child would be brought into the world in what has become the natural way.
Your extracted eggs, Marie, have been fertilized with Antonio's sperm. After screening, we are left, as you see, with 2 healthy boys and 2 very healthy girls. Naturally, no critical predispositions to any of the major inheritable diseases. All that remains is to select the most compatible candidate. You have specified hazel eyes, dark hair, and fair skin. I have taken the liberty of eradicating any potentially prejudicial conditions, premature baldness, myopia. alcoholism and addictive susceptibility, propensity for violence, obesity, etc.
We didn't want, diseases, yes, but...
Right. We were just wondering if it's good to just leave a few things to chance.
You want to give your child the best possible start. Believe me, we have enough imperfection built in already. Your child doesn't need any additional burdens.
So a big focus of the movie is that a lot of these couples are going through, at the minimum, pre-implantation genetic testing. And I know that that's something that does exist today. And mostly I think it's used for couples who know that they either have certain diseases in their family that would be really bad if their child got both gene variants, or people from adoption situations, etc. At what point do we step over a moral or ethical line with pre-implantation genetic testing? Is it when it goes beyond looking at disease to looking at physical traits like attractiveness? What do you think?
I think this is something that the LC community is still working on, really, because some things that are considered a disease may not be considered a disease by someone else. And deafness is a good example of that, right? So having a hard and fast definition of what counts as a disease that should be corrected, we know that there are some things that definitely fall into that category, that are life-threatening unless they're corrected, right? But there are other things that are simply value judgments. And drawing that line is difficult, especially when we start thinking about technologies that may someday be able to give you a designer baby, if you will. And I think one of the things you see in GATTACA is that this could then result in a pressure to utilize those technologies, even for people who do not want to utilize those. And this has been a controversy in the LC world for decades, really, about, what are the rights to genetic ignorance and what are the obligations to seek that genetic information prior to bringing a pregnancy to term, for example, because we know certain traits may or may not be present, right? So all of these things are things that we've been worried about for a long time. They're still being debated. I don't have a easy answer. That's part of what draws a philosopher like myself to this field. But it's worth continuing to think about and thinking about the most important features of the questions that we're asking in terms of what we should and should not be doing.
While they don't specifically say how they are changing the genes in these children in GATTACA, we can assume now with our knowledge since 1997 that they're probably using some type of gene editing technology. The most popular type of gene editing technology that you've likely heard about in the news is called CRISPR-Cas9. This is just a gene editing tool that can be used to modify or correct precise regions of your DNA. Currently, CRISPR genome editing is used mainly for research purposes and in a few therapeutics for sickle cell disease and inherited retinal diseases. We'll talk more about these kind of applications of CRISPR in the next episode. Scientifically, morally, and ethically, we don't have enough information to safely and in good faith attempt the kind of gene editing they were likely doing in GATTACA. A recent event caused countries around the world to rethink their regulations on this type of research.
We know that there was a scientist in China who recently decided to try to use CRISPR-Cas9 to edit the genes of twin baby girls, to edit out, off the top of my head, I can't remember the specific gene that he was editing out, but it would result in some HIV resistance, right? This same gene also, if you had neither copy of that gene, you would be conferred some resistance to HIV, but it would make you more susceptible to West Nile virus and some of the effects of West Nile virus. And so this raises some issues that we have to be aware of in sort of editing genes, of what are the ramifications, what are the side effects, what are some of the unforeseen effects of doing this. Now, a movie like GATTACA addresses some of that because it's assuming that our level of knowledge is much greater than where we're at right now. but there's still the issue of side effects and unintended effects that we have to worry about. And a lot of the things that people are worried about losing through designer babies, for example, are things that we may think we don't want to see those traits in society, but once they're gone, that will be missed.
There was a term in the movie that kind of struck me. They used the term genoism to describe prejudice and discrimination based on a person's genome. Um, Currently in our society, with the rise of direct to consumer testing, I know that there is a little bit of a fear of that happening more in the workplace, and in like insurance coverage.
Yeah.
What kind of protections do we have, and what more will we need as we have like more genetic information coming up? And if we ever reached a level like GATTACA where we knew that much and it was public, what kind of protections would we need?
Well, almost every study that's done of public attitudes toward genetic testing and concerns that people have about genetic testing identify discrimination in insurance and workplace discrimination as the two leading concerns within the general public about how their genetic information might be used against them in a negative manner. And as a result of this, uh, there was a law passed in, I believe it was 2009, called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. It's called GINA by the LC community, and it provides some protections at a federal level against the misuse of genetic information about a person to either decide whether or not to cover that person for health insurance and whether or not to set premiums at a certain level based upon their genetic information. It uh, it does not allow for that, right? So it's a protection against the use of information in that way. It also prohibits the use of genetic information in making decisions to hire and to promote people in the workplace for companies with more than 15 employees, right? So that provides some workplace protections. So Gina has the right idea. It's providing some of these protections. However, you can probably recognize yourself, there's some serious gaps in the protections that this sort of law can provide. And so the first is, you probably noticed that I said the workplace protections apply to employers with 15 or more employees, right? Uh, a lot of jobs in the United States are with small businesses that have less than 15 employees. Those businesses are not subject to the prohibitions that GINA has concerning employment discrimination or promotion discrimination. So those jobs would legally be able to use genetic information to make those decisions. So that's one gap that exists. In terms of insurance, there are protections concerning health insurance, but GINA does not apply to long-term care, to life insurance, to disability insurance. So a life insurance company, for example, can ask you if you've had a genetic test, and if so, what the results were, right? If you refuse to provide it, they can refuse to cover you. If you say you haven't, but you have, you could invalidate your insurance because you provided false information. And if you provide the information and it contains negative information, they may not cover you or may set your premium higher on the basis of that, right? So those gaps in life insurance, long-term care insurance, and disability insurance still exist, right? In addition, GINA sort of places the burden of proof on the person who was wronged to show that their genetic information was used in that inappropriate manner. And that's really hard for most people to show. You would have to have access to the meetings that took place or the minutes from the meetings that took place where these decisions were made. You know, a lot of these companies, insurance companies and big employers have staffs of lawyers that are on hand to fight any lawsuit that's brought, right? So it would be very difficult to establish this sort of misuse of genetic data. And that's also a gap that exists. So Gina has the right idea. I think it provides some very important protections, and it also articulates through its very existence our society's attitude that it's wrong to use genetic information in these discriminatory ways. But actually providing solid protections that we can rely on across the board is going to take a little bit more work in terms of the laws, both at the federal level and state level.
What about other aspects of life? Because in GATTACA, and this felt really far-fetched to me, but I mean, you could like take a DNA sample of someone you just like went on a date with and take it up to like a teller and get their DNA profile and basically like find out if they were a DNA elite or something. We're not there yet, but do you think eventually we will need, I mean, and we've talked to you before about the use of DNA in like crime and stuff. Do you think eventually we will need broader definitions of protection of the use of DNA?
Possibly, although we have to remember we do versions of this already, right? So, we know a lot of people will look and they want to marry someone tall, or, because they want children that might be in the NBA or something. We already do some forms of genetic discrimination in our selection of partners, right? And so that's happened. We also know that people who go to a sperm bank, for example, can select certain traits that are true of the donors in question, right? And some of these will be obviously genetic. Some of them may or may not be dominated by genetics, right? So there's a lot of that already takes place informally, but genetics has the potential to more formalize these sort of processes and to make them less able to be overcome, or less, or in that way, more influential in our selection process for mates and children, for example. So I think there will be concerns. I'm not sure when we're able to do that, how much protection we'll want or need, and how much we'll be comfortable with letting this informal process become formalized. I guess we'll wait and see.
This episode really highlights why we were so excited about this season with Getting Pop Culture. It's because we get to look at movies that seemed rather fantastical at the time, but when it comes down to it, this is something that is actually possible because the science has grown to this point. And so when we're discussing these things, we see the power of the science, but to quote another pop culture icon, with great power comes great responsibility. And so we have to ask a lot of really hard questions. And Sarah, I think that's why I'm so grateful for people like Tom May, who have spent their life trying to figure these questions out, because I mean, we've been asking these for years and years and years, and we still don't have answers. These are really tough.
These are definitely tough questions, and they're only going to get tougher as we learn more and as we have more genomic information available to us. So these are discussions we have to continue having.
And I think it also points to the nature of science. Science is to help us understand the world around us and help us to understand ourselves. And when it comes down to it, there's really a lot to each of us, right? It's more than just 4 simple letters. And so figuring out what makes us who we are, well, that's a very fascinating question, isn't it?
Thank you for joining us on this tiny expedition into the world of GATTACA and the ethical ramifications of human gene editing.
In our next episode, we'll continue our discussion of genetic engineering by looking at movies and TV shows that include applications of such technology.
Tiny Expeditions is a podcast about genetics, DNA, and inheritance from the HudsonAlpha Institute for Biotechnology. We're a nonprofit research institution in Huntsville, Alabama, with a unique mission.
We bring together scientists and companies to develop and apply genomic advances to make a better world. That's everything from cancer research to agriculture for a changing climate.
If you enjoyed this episode, swing by your favorite podcast app and hit that subscribe button. While you're there, consider leaving us a review. It really helps us spread the knowledge. Season 5 of Tiny Expeditions is made possible in part by our sponsor, EBSCO Information Services. They are the leading provider of online research content, search technologies, and workflow tools serving public libraries, schools, academic institutions, corporations, and medical institutions around the world, proudly delivering information access for researchers at all levels. Online at ebsco.com.
Thanks for joining us.